I'm Matt Dean, a member of the Johnston County Heritage Commission. On behalf of the Heritage Commission and the Heritage Center staff here in beautiful downtown Smithfield, we want to welcome you to the 2021 edition of our Ghost Walk. For the second year in a row, we're terribly disappointed to not be able to welcome you personally to historic Riverside Cemetery, but we've got 4 great ghosts lined up for you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. And please drop by our PayPal page and make a small contribution. All these fancy lights and cameras and post-production work are costing us a bit of money. We appreciate your financial support. Thank you and enjoy.
My name is Eli Olive, but to friend and foe alike, I am most always referred to as Eel due to my slippery reputation as a troublemaker. You can decide for yourselves if it's a fitting moniker. I opened a mercantile establishment here on South 3rd Street in 1851. We had some good years, and I bought a nice farm across the river on Black Creek Road where I settled with my wife Sarah to raise our family. The war years were hard on us, though. I had to close the business, and in 1870, Sheriff McCullum auctioned part of my land to satisfy my debts. I spent more time than I liked around the courthouse, and that's where my reputation for rambunctiousness began to grow. You see, I have a jovial demeanor, and it gets the best of me sometimes. There's a lot of stories being floating about. There's a time I rode my horse at a gallop through the Raleigh City Market on a dare, clear from Fayetteville Street to Wilmington Street, on one of the busiest shopping days of the year. There was a time I tricked a judge into selling me a tree from the courthouse yard and proceeded to dig it up, all in good fun. And once in the middle of a Smithfield courtroom, I jumped up and let out a war whoop that brought all to a standstill. The judge fined me $5, not an insignificant amount at the time. I handed the clerk a $10 bill and told him to keep the change. I'm going to holler again in a few minutes. Found I derived a great satisfaction from disturbing the hallowed proceedings of the courthouse. Many of the surviving stories of my escapades are set therein. During one Superior Court session, I hid in a back room. Suddenly, the silence of the courtroom was shattered by the sound of 2 vicious dogs fighting, locked in battle. Officers of the court rushed to the door to find only yours truly grinning from ear to ear. I had learned years earlier to mimic the sounds of many of God's creatures. The judge instructed the sheriff to throw that dog in jail and bring me the keys. And I was let off. As the sheriff opened the cell for me to go through, I pleaded, "Please don't put me in there with that snake." As the sheriff carefully peered in to investigate, I snatched the keys, gave him a shove, and locked the cell door behind. Moments later, I reappeared in the courtroom, casually walked to the bench, and handed the keys to the judge. "I have that dame dog in jail, Your Honor." I said I did ultimately spend the night in jail, but it would have been longer had not some prominent friends intervened on my behalf. Now, perhaps my most widely circulated escapade took place at the Bethesda Church here in the county. In 1865, near the close of the war, General Willis' cavalry had hanged a squad of federal foragers from a tree in the churchyard. Burmers, we called them. Pillaged all they could find and set men's homes to torch, among other unmentionable atrocities. The church building was abandoned after that. Sheep took up in the church at night, and the noises led many to believe the church was haunted by them federal bummers. Well, I suppose a party of men to investigate if ghosts really inhabited that old church. 50 men agreed to take part. Now, I went ahead alone to the church, and I stashed a white sheet and a bundle of white paper in the belfry. I hid a dozen long ropes at the back of the building. All was quiet when we gathered before the church. From the back, I slipped away unnoticed, and I tied the ropes across all the paths leading from the church and climbed to the belfry. Now, with the ghost shriek of a tormented soul, I cried out, "Why do you persecute us? In the name of the Lord, let our spirits rest." As I moaned and wailed, I waved the white sheet and showered my stricken friends with the sheets of paper in the dark room. The men bolted and raced pell-mell for the exits. As they vaulted and tripped through the ropes, crashing stopped on one top of one another while cursing and crying out in prayer. Several sustained minor injuries. I quietly coiled the ropes and gathered the sheets and went home. It took years before I was able to tell my neighbors how they had been duped. Things did not improve after the war. It only took a few years for me to buy back the land I had lost and add more acres besides. Now the farm is still owned by my descendants. And Sarah and I are buried right here, there, just at the side of Black Creek Road on the hill above Sassariza Swamp. Now I selected the gravesite myself and told everyone that it was so I could give them hell as they struggled up the steep grade after my death. Now for years people avoided passing my grave at night for fear I might be still up to no good. Now if you come to visit, you might find I still have a prank or two left to play.
Good evening, one and all. Class is in session. My name is Mary Ann Elizabeth Morgan Brown, but nobody calls me by all of those names. I'm just Betty, and I was born right here in Smithfield, just a few blocks away. My parents and I were what they called free issues. I was never enslaved, but I sure did know the effects of slavery. When I was a little girl, I would see auctions in front of the courthouse where mamas would be sold away from their children and husbands and wives would be sold away from each other to these spectators who would take them to the big slave market in Richmond. It was sadder than any funeral for sure. And there was a rule that they weren't to say anything or cry out, because if they did, they were likely to get the whip. That's right. I could tell you stories you would hardly believe that happened here before those Yankee soldiers came through in '65. If you were a person of color, chances were you could not read or write. For the enslaved, that was the law. For free issues like me, it was frowned on. Well, just a few months after the soldiers left, 3 young white ladies from Boston came here and started a school. They were from the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, and they were sent here to help my people learn how to read and write and do math so we could all be free. I mean, really free. Without education, we would all be slaves even today. Don't you agree? Well, my papa and some other men in town got together and built a little schoolhouse. It was not much of a building, but that didn't matter to the hundreds who piled in there hungry for learning. There were young folks, old folks, and every age in between, and they came from all over the countryside. They wouldn't all fit in the building, which had very poor lighting to start with, so when the weather was nice, we had class outside. Here I was, 20 years old and just learning my ABCs, but I was a fast learner and was reading the Bible before long. I helped out teaching the little ones, and I found out that was my calling. I then married my sweetheart, Ned Brown, and we lived with Mama and Papa. Things were going along pretty good. Then late one Saturday night, somebody set fire to the schoolhouse. That fire destroyed the school, the house where the teachers were staying, and a store. But we were determined not to miss school on Monday, so several families, black families, cleared out their furniture, and we turned their little homes into schoolhouses. That's right, our minds were stayed on a goal, and honey, no fire was gonna stop us. The Boston ladies had to leave town after a year because the Aid Society ran out of money. Miss Hamilton was one of those 3, and she stayed on a few more months without a salary, while Papa and men like Mr. Rafe and Mr. Bryant Alford built another school. Times were tough, but we carried on. Another group of missionary teachers came from up north and recruited me to help them teach. They got the Freedmen's Bureau to build a new, nice 2-room school on 4th Street. It had lots of windows for light, plaster on the walls, and sliding doors in the middle so we could close off a room for advanced students. They put in new factory-made desks and had a reed organ sent in from New York. We thought we were something in our new schoolhouse, I'm telling you. And the building is still standing. I understand there's a group that's fixing it up. My papa, Eli Morgan, and I are buried right here. He died in 1870, and I died in my prime at only 35 in the year 1880. Mama lived so long that by the time she died, they had segregation laws and no longer allowed persons of color to be buried here. So she's buried way the other side of the river. I had a hard life, but I'm proud of the work we did to get our people educated. I would certainly do it all over again. I now bid you a good night, and class dismissed.
Good evening. I am Dr. Charles Furlong, and I have come back to Johnston County to tell you fine people some stories about the 50 years or so that I doctored people here in Johnston County. I was born in 1887 into a poor family with 8 children far from here on an island called Montserrat in the British West Indies. I grew up in Antigua and Trinidad, and my mother was a healer. It was her work with herbal remedies that inspired me to go into medicine. I started out as a pharmacist, but back then, pharmacists had to be on duty all night. There was a doctor on the island who went to New York for his schooling, and he told me that a poor boy like me could get an education there if I had guts. I went to New York. I got a job in the daytime and went to high school at night so that I could prepare myself for medical school. I worked at a country club on Long Island, and I learned to play tennis. I really loved it. I also found my wife, Alice, who was also from Barbados in the Caribbean. Well, as it turned out, I got into a medical school at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was called Leonard Medical School. My friends, it was certainly a rude awakening for me as I traveled down south. I had excellent professors, but they were all white. But they turned out some well-trained black doctors. But would you believe? All of us graduated, but we found out later that we were barred from the American Medical Association and local and state societies. And it was all because of the color of our skin. This did not keep us from seeking medical advice from white doctors, or when we needed it, or also giving them advice. I finished Leonard in 1916, and I heard about a shortage of black doctors in eastern North Carolina. I was told I should go to Dunn and hang my shingle there. So that's what I set out to do. When my train stopped in Selma, there was an ice storm, so I got delayed. I met a fella named Wall, and he convinced me to stay in Selma. He let me use an upstairs room in his own home. A year later, I got a chance to move to Smithfield, and that's where I would stay for the next 50-some years. For a long time, I was the only African-American physician in this whole county of Johnston. That's right. The closest hospitals where black folks could get treated were in Raleigh and Durham. Then a privately owned Johnston County Hospital was built in 1926. It had a colored ward, which included 3 rooms accessible through a back entrance. From a racial standpoint, it was separate, but certainly not equal. And I was not given privileges to treat patients there. I had to have a better place to treat my patients, so I built a little hospital across town. It had 12 beds, later 15, an operating room, living quarters for nurses, dining and kitchen facilities, and an office. This was in the Depression, folks, but black teachers and students and black church groups raised money to help me furnish it. I performed routine procedures in the OR, but I would send patients to Raleigh or Durham if it was something very serious. I trained midwives and delivered countless babies in my hospital and in private homes. I gave physical examinations and vaccinations to school children. Alice and I had 2 daughters, as well as foster children. When I started out here, I could walk for miles to see patients until I could afford a horse and buggy. Then I got my first automobile. That was a happy day. I built up my practice, and we were able to build an attractive Tudor-styled home on South 5th Street. I put in my own tennis court across the street. I usually kept a shiny new Buick. There were a lot of young people who depended on me for advice and encouragement through the years as they came into the Furlong Hospital. It was always thrilling to hear about their successes, especially when they became doctors and nurses. In 1951, we got a new hospital in Johnston County, but there was still strict segregation. Separate but equal was what it was called. The second floor was for blacks, unless they ran out of beds on the other floors. They had separate waiting rooms, restrooms, labor and delivery rooms, newborn nurseries, and dining rooms. The black nurses and I couldn't eat in the cafeteria. We had to take meals in a tiny little lounge where the orderlies and housekeepers ate. The operating room was the only space not segregated by race. And the blood bank was segregated only by blood type, not by the race of the donor. But I was grateful that I had privileges in the new hospital, unlike the old one. But when I finally retired in the late 1960s, things were changing quickly. When I died in 1972, segregation had become a thing of the past. I surely was glad. And now I will bid you a good night.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you here tonight. My name is Sarah Isador Hood. I was born in 1855 to John C. Hood and Martha Hood. I have several brothers and sisters, many. We grew up in the little town of Bentonville. My father owned a carriage shop. As he worked day and night, most of the men in the town worked for him also. It was early spring, March of 1865, and we had heard about the Battle of Atlanta, with General Sherman guiding his troops and destroying everything in sight. We knew the news that he was on the way. He was coming, so we had to get ready for whatever was going to happen. Well, Papa had us bury all of our silver and china and money in several different places, and the slaves that were in town also buried theirs. They did not want their things taken either. Well, the battle soon started. It was March the 19th of 1865. It raged for days, 3 full days. Homes and outbuildings were used for all the wounded that were brought in, both gray and blue troops alike. My brothers and I helped nurse some of these in the days that went on. So on about the third day of the battle, one of my brothers who was suffering from the measles became very, very ill. My mother sent me to find my father, who had been taken by the Yankees at that time. So I crawled along many ways, under horses, around Federal troops, hiding from them as I tried to go to a neighbor's house. I got to her home. She could not leave because the Yankees were there tearing up even her beds and mattresses while she was watching them. So I left to go back home. I had not gone far when a Yankee infantryman on horseback came by and offered me a ride, and went after he asked where I was going. I told him my little brother was very sick and I was looking for help and I needed a doctor. He offered me the ride home, and I refused at first. I was afraid to ride with a Yankee. But many around encouraged me to let him take me back because it was dangerous that day. So he took me back. He even came in the house and checked on my little brother. When he saw how sick he was, he went and found a Union doctor and came and brought him. And they checked my little brother, but nothing could be done, and he died that night. We didn't have a casket, of course, so Aunt Jane, who was one of the black slaves, helped me put him in a goods box, and we buried him in that, and then after the war, we went back and they dug him up, and then they buried him in a casket. Many of the houses were being burned all around us. And as they began to get closer to us, we got under the house and crawled into the hole that Papa had dug previously for us to hide in when things got bad. Many of the neighbors were at our house at that time, and a lady named Mrs. Cole, who was a very funny lady, when she realized that my mother had a new baby and was going to have to crawl under that house on her stomach and with the baby and hide, Mrs. Cole said, "I will eat the devil if you can get under the house with that baby." But my mother did, and we hid for over a day in this hole under the house. They were burning houses all around, and they even tried to burn ours, but several of the slaves got out and stopped the fires. Shots, shells, wounded, dying, houses burning, blood flowing, groaning, and wounded all linger with me to this very day. General Sherman commanded over 60,000 troops against us. There were less than 30,000 of General Johnston's troops. Near the end of the battle, my father was wounded and brought into the house. And then later, General Johnston was wounded. They brought him to our house, where he waited until an ambulance was brought to take him away for treatment. Many years later, 75 to be exact, my family took me to Oxford, North Carolina, to a theater to see the movie Gone with the Wind. You know, those of you who have seen it, about the battle scenes there. They all reminded me of what we went through. I felt like I was right back at Bentonville again, 75 years earlier. But thank the Lord, we were all spared, most of my family, and we still today remember those days of the Battle at Bentonville.